Payback Times.
The tea had gone lukewarm in my hand before I noticed I'd stopped drinking it. I'd been standing at the window for maybe 4 minutes, long enough to watch Prescott Langley pause at the east garden wall, gesture toward the carriage house, with the particular authority of a man who believes the gesture belongs to him, and then reach inside his blazer to produce a folded document. He handed it to the man beside him with the practiced ease of a closing handshake. Smooth. Rehearsed. The kind of smooth that only comes from having done a thing many times. The stranger had a clipboard. A good one. The aluminum kind with a hinged storage compartment. He accepted the document, scanned it, and then lifted his phone to photograph the carriage house. Then the pool house. Then the iron gate at the rear easement where my father had planted a row of white gardenias 30 years ago, because my mother said they smelled like the courtyard of her grandmother's house in Lagos. I set the tea down on the windowsill with barely a sound. I had not been told about any inspection, no contractor visit, no appraisal, no mention in any of the 3 conversations I'd had with Prescott this week of anyone walking Villa Harrow today. I'd left for Nadia's house at 9:30 this morning and come home 2 hours early because my sister had fallen asleep on the couch mid-sentence, exhausted from the new baby and pretending otherwise. I'd kissed her forehead and let myself out without waking her. I was supposed to still be gone. The thought settled over me like a second skin, cold and precise. Below the window, Prescott said something that made the clipboard man smile. They moved toward the pool house together with the unhurried confidence of men who expect. I reached for my phone. 3 photographs. I kept my position behind the sheer curtain, angling the lens to catch Prescott's face and the stranger's clipboard in the same frame, the gardenia gate in the background, the carriage house door still open. I checked the timestamp on each image and transferred them immediately to my encrypted notes application, the one I'd been using since my compliance days, when documentation wasn't just habit, but survival. I labelled the folder with today's date in a single word, observed. Then I smoothed my linen trousers, picked up my tea and walked outside to enjoy my garden. Solange. Prescott turned with a smile that arrived 1 precise second before it should have. I didn't know you were home. Nadia needed sleep more than she needed company, I said, setting my mug on the garden table and pulling out a chair. Beautiful afternoon for it, though. The roses are finally doing what I asked them to. I didn't look at the clipboard man directly. I looked at the roses. Prescott recovered with the ease of long practice. He was 61 years old and wore his silver hair with the groomed confidence of a man accustomed to being photographed. Tall, well-cut jacket. The kind of face that made homeowners association boards and bank officers feel immediately comfortable. "This is Garrett Wills," he said, gesturing toward the stranger. "He was in the area. I asked him to take a look at the drainage situation along the east wall. We've had some erosion concerns I wanted a second opinion on." Garrett Wills extended a hand. Firm grip. Khaki trousers with a crease. He had the particular professional neutrality of someone who has been briefed on what not to say. "Drainage," I said pleasantly. "Has it been a problem?" I hadn't noticed anything. "Just being proactive," Prescott said. "Part of the job." I smiled and turned back to the roses. I'm glad someone's being thorough. We chatted for 7 more minutes. I asked after Prescott's wife, Eleanor, who I genuinely liked. I mentioned that the wisteria along the south fence needed trimming. I did not ask about the document Prescott had handed over. I did not ask what Garrett Wills's clipboard contained, or why a drainage consultant would photograph a gate and a pool house, or whether any of this had been logged anywhere for the benefit of the trust's other beneficiaries. I had learned in 22 years of forensic accounting that the most valuable thing you can sometimes do is ask nothing at all. Prescott stayed for dinner. He often did on weekends, a gentle, persistent presence since my father's death 18 months ago, this performance of loyalty. He brought a bottle of Barolo and complimented the lamb and told a story about a development project in the North Hills that had me noting 3 separate inconsistencies in his timeline. I smiled through all of it. It was over the last of the wine that he mentioned refinancing. "I've been looking at the trust's asset position," he said, with the measured casualness of a man who had rehearsed casualness. "Interest rates are doing some interesting things. There may be an opportunity to refinance the villa, unlock some liquidity for the portfolio. Just in early consideration stages, but it's worth being aware of." He looked at me the way people look at someone they believe is still soft with grief. My father had been dead for 18 months. My mother for 3 years before that. Prescott had watched me manage both losses, with what I suspected he read as quiet devastation, and what was actually, in part, the hypervigilance of a woman who had spent 2 decades catching people with their hands in the wrong places. I said, refilling his glass. "The portfolio needs liquidity." "Just considering options. Being a good steward." He smiled. "That's the job. Steward." The word lodged somewhere behind my sternum. "My father always said you were thorough," I said. "He trusted that about you." Prescott accepted this with the practiced grace of a man who collects trust, the way others collect art. He left at 9:30. I stood at the door and watched his car until the taillights disappeared around the curve of the drive. Then I went to my father's study. The trust documents lived in a fireproof box in the bottom drawer of the rosewood desk my father had brought back from a business trip to Accra in 1987. The box was locked, had been since the day I moved back into the villa, and I was the only person to my knowledge who had a key to it, to my knowledge. I made a note of that caveat in my private log before I sat down. The Adeyemi Family Revocable Trust had been drafted in 2009 and amended twice before my father's death. 14 pages. I had read them cover to cover at the time of his passing, and again 3 months later, and I had said nothing to anyone about what I'd understood, because at that point I was still deciding what I was looking at. Tonight I read them differently. Tonight I had photographs dated and time-stamped on my phone and a dinner conversation that hadn't mentioned those photographs once. I turned to Article 6, Trustee Powers and Duties. My father's attorney had been thorough, bless the man, wherever he was retired now. The language was precise and comprehensive. The trustee holds the power to manage, invest, reinvest, lease, sell, exchange, and encumber trust assets in accordance with the prudent investor standard. The trustee may enter into contracts on behalf of the trust. The trustee may retain professionals, authorise appraisals and take actions reasonably necessary for the administration of the trust estate. Wide language. Intentionally so. My father had wanted flexibility, not bureaucracy. But I kept reading. Subsection 6.4. Encumbrances and refinancing. Prior to placing any mortgage, lien, deed of trust, or other encumbrance upon real property held in the trustee shall provide written notice to all adult income beneficiaries no fewer than 30 days in advance, setting forth the nature, terms, and purpose of the proposed encumbrance. 30 days. Written notice. All adult income beneficiaries, I, Solange Adeyemi-Whitfield, was an adult income beneficiary. So was my brother Marcus, so was my younger sister Yemi, who lived in Toronto and trusted Prescott more than I did, largely because she was 3,000 kilometres away and had never spent 22 years watching the small frictions between what people say and what they do. None of us had received written notice of anything. I sat with that for a moment. The house was quiet around me, the particular quality of quiet that belongs to large old houses at night, full of the sounds of itself. Wood settling, the distant hum of the climate system, the faint scent of the orange blossom candle I'd lit on the desk. Here was what I understood about trustees that most people don't pause long enough to learn. The title sounds like ownership. The way people say it sounds like ownership. The trustee manages the property. The trustee makes the decisions. And when a trustee is also a respected figure in your community, a man your father called a friend for 9 years, the perception of ownership can become so ambient that no one thinks to interrogate it. But a trustee is not an owner. A trustee is a steward. Prescott had used that word himself tonight, with the comfortable ease of a man who understood its performance value without fully accounting for its legal weight. A trustee holds assets in trust for the benefit of someone else. The beneficiaries. The people those assets are actually meant to serve. And that distinction, that fundamental non-negotiable distinction, is what transforms the trustee's broad powers from simple authority into something much more constrained, a fiduciary duty. Fiduciary. From the Latin fiducia, trust, confidence, reliance. When you are a fiduciary, your own interests are legally subordinated to the interests of the people you serve. You can't simply decide that refinancing is a good idea and begin exploring it. You can't meet with appraisers on a Saturday afternoon and then mention the concept over wine as though it's a new thought that arrived at the dinner table. You are required, not encouraged, but required to keep beneficiaries informed, to seek their awareness, to allow them the 30 days the document in my hands specified in subsection 6.4. Prescott had held this trusteeship for 18 months. I had signed no notice. Marcus had signed no notice. I would call Yemi tomorrow to be certain, but I already knew. I also knew something Prescott did not know I knew. I had seen the document he handed to Garrett Wills. Not its contents, not from the window, but its format. Standard letter paper, folded in thirds, removed from an inside blazer pocket. That's not a drainage assessment. Drainage assessments don't come folded in a breast pocket. They come in rolled tubes or file folders. They come with moisture readings and survey maps. What comes folded in a breast pocket is something you're ready to sign. I flagged subsection 6.4 with a small adhesive tab from the desk drawer, the pale yellow ones my father used to use for the same purpose, still in their original dispenser, and I set the document aside. Then I called Delia. Delia Marchetti Cross and I had been colleagues for 6 years before she left compliance to pursue estate law. She'd sent me a plant when my mother died and a bottle of very good cognac when my father died, and we'd had dinner 3 times in the past year. She picked up on the second ring despite it being nearly 10 o'clock, because Delia kept the hours of a person whose brain refuses to downshift. Solange. Tell me you're not calling to cancel Thursday. Thursday is sacred, I said. I'm calling because I had an interesting Saturday. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular. Her daughter's college applications, the restaurant we were planning to try, a mutual friend's recent and somewhat dramatic divorce. I let the conversation breathe. I've learned that you get more from people when you let them arrive at things naturally, when the question doesn't feel like a question. It was Delia who steered us there eventually, the way she always does, with a precision she disguises as curiosity. How are things with the trust? Wasn't Prescott Langley appointed successor trustee? He was. I paused, looking at the subsection I'd flagged. Tell me something. If a trustee is in early stages of exploring refinancing options on trust-held real property and the beneficiaries haven't received any formal notice, at what point does that become a problem? A brief silence. The shift in register was almost audible, Delia moving from friend to attorney the way I used to move from colleague to investigator. That particular change in the quality of attention. Define early stages, she said, bringing unidentified parties onto the property for what appears to be assessment purposes. Mentioning refinancing to a beneficiary as a casual dinner topic, without prior written notice, without any notice. Then it's already a problem, Delia said. Her voice was careful now even. The duty of disclosure isn't triggered by the moment of signing, it's triggered by material action, by the trustee taking substantive steps toward a decision that affects beneficiaries' interests. If he's authorising assessments on trust property without informing beneficiaries, and the trust instrument requires advance notice, that's not a technicality. That's a breach of fiduciary duty. The phrase settled over the room like a weather change. What remedies does a beneficiary have? Several. Petition the court for a trustee accounting. Request removal of the trustee for misconduct. Seek an injunction to prevent a transaction from proceeding. Potentially pursue damages if harm can be demonstrated. She paused. Solange, are you asking me theoretically? I'm asking you precisely the way I mean to ask you. Another pause, then. Call me tomorrow, not as friends, catching up. I'll bring the trust documents, I said. After I hung up, I sat for a long moment in my father's chair. The room was full of him in the way that felt both comforting and unbearable. His framed architectural drawings on the walls, the progression of the villa from sketch to blueprint, to the photograph taken at completion in 1983, when he was 40 years old and grinning like a man who had just proved something important. His reading lamp, still angled the way he liked it. The faint memory of his pipe tobacco in the cushion of the chair, or maybe that was my imagination, making its usual demands. He had built this estate over 40 years. Not just the buildings, but the whole structure of it. The trust that was supposed to carry it forward past his death, past all of our deaths, intact and whole, and still serving the family it was built for. He had chosen Prescott Langley because Prescott had seemed for 9 years like a man of substance and reliability, a man who understood value. He thinks I'm grieving. I thought. He thinks I'm distracted. I said it aloud, quietly, to the framed drawings. He thinks I'm grieving. He thinks I'm distracted. My father's 26-year-old self grinned back at me from the photograph, blueprint in hand. I opened my laptop and created a new spreadsheet. I labelled it in clean, unambiguous capital letters, Langley Documentation Log. The columns came to me without effort. Date, observation, source, supporting documentation, follow-up required. I'd built 100 of these in my professional life, and the architecture of evidence collection is muscle memory once you've lived inside it, long enough. My phone buzzed on the desk. Marcus. His name appeared on the screen with the small profile photo he'd taken at his daughter's birthday party last spring. Laughing, holding a ridiculous paper crown. My brother trusted easily and well, which had always been both his gift and his vulnerability. The message read, "Hey, Prescott says we're having a family meeting next week about the property. He says there might be an exciting opportunity. You hear anything? I read it twice. Then I typed, "Nothing yet. Let me know what you find out." I set the phone face down on the desk. An exciting opportunity. In my experience, that phrase deployed in the context of trust property by a man who had spent a Saturday afternoon with an unidentified assessor and a folded document in his breast pocket was not a beginning. It was a conclusion someone else had already reached on your behalf, dressed in the language of invitation. The question was how far along that conclusion was, and how much damage a well-timed intervention could prevent. I turned back to the screen. The spreadsheet waited, clean and empty and full of potential. I began to type. Prescott had arranged the dining room the way he arranged everything, with the careful aesthetic of a man who understood that presentation is persuasion. The good china on the sideboard, a leather-bound portfolio at each seat, afternoon light falling through the tall windows at precisely the angle that made the room look like something from an architectural magazine, which I suspected was not an accident. Marcus arrived first, still in his work clothes from the morning, the sleeves of his dress shirt rolled to the elbow. He kissed my cheek and picked up the leather portfolio with the appreciative curiosity of someone who had already decided to be impressed. "Nice touch," he murmured, flipping through the first few pages. Nadia came in behind him carrying the baby in a wrap across her chest, which was just like her, refusing to leave Amara with the sitter for a meeting she had decided was not serious. She looked better than she had on Saturday, rested enough to smile with some actual warmth. Prescott kissed her cheek with the practiced tenderness of a family friend, who had learned precisely how much familiarity each person would receive as a compliment. I sat down and opened my portfolio. The document was 40 pages, professionally designed, printed on heavy stock with the Langley Premier Group wordmark in discreet gunmetal grey at the bottom corner of every page. Photographs of what appeared to be a completed luxury development in the East Corridor showed all glass and pale stone. Projected return figures appeared in a clean infographic on page 7. It was beautiful work. I recognised the design firm from a hotel I had stayed in twice. Whoever had put this together had spent money on it. I read the footnotes while Prescott poured sparkling water and asked about Nadia's mother-in-law, and whether Marcus's daughter had gotten the sports scholarship she had been hoping for. There it was. Footnote 14. In 8-point type. Langley Premier Group LLC is an entity in which the trustee holds a controlling interest. The proposed investment represents a related party transaction and has been structured to provide returns consistent with the trust's investment policy objectives. A related party transaction. Disclosed in footnote 14 in 8-point type on a 4-page section most people would never read. I looked up and smiled when Prescott said my name. "Solange, I am so glad we could all be together for this. I think your father would have loved what we are building." He sat at the head of the table, not at the side, not neutrally, and I noted that too, without blinking. "It is a beautiful document," I said. "You have clearly put a lot of thought into this." He began his presentation. He was good at it. I granted him that without reservation. The man knew how to hold a room, how to make figures sound like poetry, how to say the word liquidity as though it were a form of abundance rather than what it actually is, which is the conversion of an asset into something that can move. He talked about the villa's equity, about the low-rate refinancing environment, about the opportunity to put the trust's capital to work in a development that would, in his words, carry the Adeyemi name into the next generation of this city's skyline. Marcus leaned forward. What are we talking in terms of returns? Conservative projection is 12% annually over 5 years, Prescott said. We have built in a margin of safety on the development timeline. Nadia shifted Amara in the wrap. And the villa stays in the family? The villa remains a trust asset throughout. The refinancing simply frees up equity that is currently sitting idle. I waited until he had finished, until the room had absorbed the warmth of his presentation, and Marcus had asked 2 follow-up questions, and Nadia had laughed at something he had said about the building's rooftop garden. Then I said pleasantly, Prescott, before we go further, can you walk us through the independent investment analysis? I would love to understand how the 12% projection was stress-tested. He looked at me with the patient warmth of a man who expected to redirect a concern. We worked with our internal analysts on the projections. I understand that. I'm asking about independent analysis. Someone outside Langley Premier Group who reviewed the investment merits on the Trust's behalf. A half-beat pause. The projections are based on comparable developments in the... Who engaged the independent advisor? I asked. Was it the Trust's investment committee, or did you bring someone in directly? Solange. His voice took on the gentle quality people use with elderly relatives. The Trust does not have an investment committee per se. That is within my purview as trustee to evaluate. Of course, I said. And the investment policy statement, did the proposed allocation to a single private development fall within the risk parameters outlined there? I recall my father's IPS was fairly conservative on concentration limits. Nadia was looking at me with the particular expression my sister reserves for moments when she suspects I know something she does not. Marcus had stopped leaning forward. Prescott smiled. These are exactly the kinds of questions I would expect from a careful family. I think once we get into the details together, you will see how thoroughly this has been considered. He moved the conversation forward with the practiced ease of someone changing lanes in traffic. Marcus let him. Nadia let him. I set my pen down on the portfolio and did not write a single thing at the table. I did not need to. I had already photographed footnote 14 with my phone beneath the table while he was pouring water. 3 questions, 0 direct answers. I logged it that evening under a new column heading, Evasion. The certified mail receipt came back 11 days after I sent the request. Signed by a receptionist, not by Prescott. Which meant he had let it sit in his office, long enough to feel like a considered response rather than a flinch. I had sent it the morning after the family meeting. Written on plain white paper, professional and precise, as a named income beneficiary of the Adeyemi Family Revocable Trust, I was formally requesting a complete accounting of all trust transactions for the preceding 3 years, including but not limited to investment activity, real property income, expenditures, and any related party transactions. I cited the relevant provision of the trust instrument. I cited the applicable state statute. I sent it certified mail, return receipt requested, and I emailed a copy to the attorney of record, listed on the original trust documents, a man named Hargrove, who I suspected Prescott assumed was a formality. Prescott called me that same afternoon. Solange. He was warm. He was smooth. There was something underneath the smoothness that had not been there at the dinner table. I got your letter. I hoped it would arrive quickly. I want you to know I completely understand the impulse. You are being careful. That is admirable. But I do not want formality to get in the way of the kind of open conversation your father always valued. If you have concerns, I would much rather sit down and... "I appreciate that," I said. "The request stands." A pause, not long, a second, maybe less, but I had spent 22 years listening for pauses. "Of course," he said. "Happy to oblige." I logged the call. Time, duration, summary, tone shift. Under follow-up required, I wrote, "Watch for incomplete response." 2 weeks later, the accounting arrived. 63 pages in a manila envelope with no cover letter. I spread it across the kitchen island with a cup of coffee and read it the way I read everything, slowly, tracking the gaps before I tracked before. The content. 3 transaction categories were missing. The rental income records for properties 2 and 3, the Craftsman fourplex on Alderton Street, and the commercial unit on the Murray corridor were not included. Neither was any documentation related to an investment account I knew existed, because I had seen its statement header in a file on my father's desk 3 weeks before his death. And there was no record whatsoever of any appraisal activity on the villa or associated properties, which meant that Garrett Wills and his clipboard did not exist, as far as Prescott's accounting was concerned. I photographed every page. I made 2 paper copies. I placed 1 copy in the fireproof box with the trust documents. I took the original and my notes and drove to Delia's office. Delia Marchetti Cross had built her practice the way she built arguments, from the foundation up, without ornamentation. Her conference room reflected this: a large rectangular table, good task lighting, a window that looked onto a quiet street, rather than a view designed to impress. She had spread the documents across the table by the time I sat down across from her, and she was already reading with the focused stillness of someone who does not need to perform concentration. "Give me 40 minutes, she said, without looking up. I made myself tea from the credenza and sat in the chair nearest the window and let her work. It was 52 minutes before she set her pen down. 4 things, she said, in increasing order of severity. I turned my notepad to a fresh page. First, the failure to disclose. The notice requirement in subsection 6.4 of the trust instrument requires 30 days written notice before any encumbrance of real property. He brought an assessor onto the property. You have photographs dated and time-stamped, without providing that notice. That is a breach of the duty to inform. It is not catastrophic on its own, but it is the foundation. I nodded. I had flagged this the night I pulled the trust documents from the box. Second, the missing rental records. Delia tapped the accounting with 1 finger. A trustee has an absolute duty to account to beneficiaries, not a qualified duty, not a best efforts duty. Absolute. The rental income from those 2 properties has to be documented. Where it came from, where it went, how it was applied within the trust. The absence of those records in this accounting is not an oversight. An oversight is a misplaced decimal. This is 3 years of income from 2 separate properties. That is a failure of the duty to account, and it is the kind of failure that raises questions about where that income actually went. I had done the math already. Based on market rates for comparable properties in those locations, the missing rental income could represent somewhere between $400,000 and $600,000 across 3 years. I slid my calculations across the table. Delia looked at them and said nothing for a moment. Third, the investment policy statement. She pulled a page from the stack, the one I had flagged before leaving the house. There is an amendment here, signed 8 months ago, that removed the concentration limit on single-asset private investments. Your father's original IPS capped any single private investment at 10% of the portfolio. This amendment removed that cap entirely. It bears Prescott's signature as trustee. She paused. It does not bear any beneficiary acknowledgement. No notification, no consent, no record of independent review. He amended the investment policy without telling us. He amended it without telling you, which freed him to put an unlimited percentage of trust assets into a single private investment. She looked at me steadily. The investment he then proposed to you was his own company. I had understood this already. Hearing it spoken in the measured tone of an attorney who has stopped being surprised by human behaviour was a different thing entirely. And fourth, Delia said, the related party transaction, footnote 14. Self-dealing. Classic self-dealing, yes. A trustee has an absolute duty of loyalty, meaning every decision the trustee makes must be made for the benefit of the beneficiaries, not for the benefit of the trustee. When Prescott Langley directs trust funds into an investment in which he personally holds a controlling interest without independent review, without full disclosure, without beneficiary consent, that is not a judgment call. That is a violation of the duty of loyalty. It does not matter that he disclosed it in the footnotes. It matters that he structured the entire proposal around a transaction that financially benefits him. She folded her hands on the table. Solange, this is not incompetence. This is a pattern. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, a city bus went by, unhurried. How do we document the pattern? I asked. She smiled, just slightly. You already started that. I was in the garden on a Thursday evening, deadheading the roses with more patience than I actually felt, when Delia called. He filed a motion, she said. There was no preamble. Preliminary motion to authorise the refinancing without full beneficiary consent. Filed this morning. He is citing a provision that allows the trustee to act in the trust's best interest during periods of beneficiary disagreement. I set down the pruning shears. He did not notify me before filing. No. That is required, is not it? He was supposed to serve all beneficiaries simultaneously with the court filing. He served Marcus and Yemi, not you. I stood in the garden for a moment with the late sun on my face and the smell of cut roses and the particular cold clarity that arrives when someone who has been underestimating you takes the first irreversible step. What is our response window? 21 days, but Solange, there is something else. She paused just long enough for me to understand this was the second thing, the worst thing. I have a contact in the county assessor's office. She called me this afternoon about something she thought I should know. The carriage house and the rear easement parcel at Villa Harrow have been informally flagged in a development inquiry database as available for potential separate acquisition. The gardenias were blooming along that rear easement, my mother's gardenias. He listed trust property for sale, I said, without authorisation. Informally, no formal listing agreement yet, but the flag is there, and it is dated 6 weeks ago. Before the family meeting, before the accounting request, before any of this was supposedly under consideration. 6 weeks ago. Before he sat at my father's dining table and called it an exciting opportunity. Before he poured the sparkling water and complimented Nadia's baby and said the villa would remain a trust asset throughout. He has been moving faster than he looked, I said. He thought he had more time, Delia said. Send me everything you have. We will file a response to the motion and a formal petition for accounting. And I would like to request an emergency hearing on the sale flag. We can argue that any unauthorised disposition of trust assets, even informal, warrants immediate court attention. After I hung up, I stood in the garden for another few minutes. The roses needed water. I turned on the drip line and went inside. He arrived at 8:15 on a Friday evening without calling ahead. I heard the car on the drive and watched from the study window as he came up the front steps with the ease of a man who has always felt welcome in a house. I had learned in the past month to notice the difference between ease that is earned and ease that is assumed. Prescott's was the second kind. I was at my father's desk when he knocked, which is to say I was already where I intended to be when he found me. I called out that the door was open. I had unlocked it when I heard his car, quietly, before returning to my chair. He came through the house the way he always did, unhurried, proprietary. He paused in the study doorway and took in the room. The stacks of documents, the laptop screen, the row of adhesive-tabbed folders I had arranged by date along the edge of the desk. "Working late?" he said. "Always something that needs attention." I gestured toward the chair across from the desk. "Sit down, Prescott." He sat. He looked comfortable. I have noticed that men who are accustomed to controlling a room often look most comfortable in the moment before they reveal they have lost it. "I wanted to come by," he said. "I think there has been some miscommunication around the legal process. The motion I filed is a standard procedural step, Solange. It is not adversarial. I should have looped you in before it went to court, and I apologise for that oversight." Oversight. The same word I had told myself it was not, sitting in Delia's conference room. "I appreciate you coming," I said. "I think what is happening here is that you are carrying a lot. Your father, your mother, you have been through a significant period of loss, and it makes sense that you would want to hold tightly to everything he left. I understand that impulse." He leaned forward slightly. "But the trust is a financial instrument, not a memorial, and the decisions I am making are designed to grow what your father built, not diminish it." I looked at him. I kept my face entirely neutral, which was not difficult. I had sat across from a great many people in my career who believed they were explaining something to me. "Solange." His voice dropped into something quieter, more direct. The charm had shifted into something with an edge under it. "With all due respect, your father trusted me with this because he knew you would let sentiment get in the way of good business." He paused, and when he continued, the word arrived like something he had been carrying for a while, and decided to finally put down. "You are a bookkeeper, sweetheart. Let the grown-ups handle the portfolio." The study was very quiet. My father's drawings hung on the walls, the villa in 4 stages of becoming, from the first pencil sketch to the blueprint to the completed photograph, where a 40-year-old man grinned at the camera with his whole future still in front of him. I looked at Prescott Langley for a long moment. I took in the confidence, the slight lean forward, the certainty of a man who has just said the sentence he had been saving and expected it to land and settle the matter. "Thank you, Prescott," I said. "I will make sure the court hears exactly that." He laughed. It was a short, dismissive sound, the laugh of a man who thought he had been given a joke instead of a warning. I did not laugh. He stood after another few minutes of conversation that I mostly let him conduct, and I walked him to the door with the pleasant composure of a hostess who has had a perfectly ordinary evening. I stood in the open doorway until his car disappeared around the curve. Then I went back to the study, sat down in my father's chair, and was quiet for exactly 60 seconds. I have done this since my compliance days, 60 seconds of stillness after a significant moment, to let the adrenaline settle before I do anything that requires precision. Then I picked up my phone and called Delia. "He made a mistake," I said. "I know." Her voice was steady. "And I know what it was." "The motion?" "The motion filed in the county where your father's original trust was probated. Judge Anita Vasseur is assigned to it. She clerked for the Trust Division for 12 years before she took the bench. She has written 3 published opinions on trustee fiduciary duty." A pause. "She will read every page." I exhaled slowly. Outside, the last of the evening light was fading from the garden, and somewhere along the rear easement I knew my mother's gardenias were pale and perfect in the dusk. "Then let us give her something worth reading," I said. I opened my laptop. The documentation log, begun on the night I had labelled it in clean capital letters while Marcus's text sat face down on the desk, now spanned 47 pages. Timestamps and photographs and call logs and annotated accounting documents and a copy of footnote 14 with the 8-point type enlarged to 24. A copy of the amended investment policy statement with the beneficiary acknowledgement section conspicuously, damningly blank. I pulled up a fresh page at the end of the log and began to type. The trustee had significant power. My father had drafted it that way deliberately, because he understood that good stewardship requires latitude, the freedom to make prudent decisions without convening a committee for every transaction. He had trusted Prescott with the duty of loyalty, every decision made for the beneficiary's benefit, not the trustee's own. He had trusted him with the duty to account, full financial transparency, not 63 pages with 3 categories missing. He had trusted him with the duty of prudence, careful, diversified, unconflicted investment decisions. He had trusted him with the duty to inform, advance notice before anything material was decided, because beneficiaries are not passengers, they are the entire point. Prescott had understood the power. He had not understood, or had decided not to honour, the obligations that made that power legitimate. That was the distinction my father had staked his family's future on, and it was the distinction I intended to put before Judge Anita Vasseur in language so clear and so thoroughly documented that every page would stand on its own. I had 47 pages. I intended to give her 50 by morning. I began to type. I showed Marcus on a Tuesday night, at his kitchen table, with his youngest daughter asleep down the hall, and a pot of tea between us that went cold while he read. He didn't speak for a long time after he finished. He sat with his hands flat on the documentation log, all 51 pages of it now printed and tabbed, and looked at the middle distance in the way men look when they are recalculating something they were certain of. The rental income, he finally said. $342,000 over 3 years, I said. Routed through an LLC called Harrow Capital Management. Prescott is the sole managing member. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. I was excited about the proposal. I know. I called Yemi and told her it sounded solid. I know that too. He was quiet again. Then, why didn't you say something at the meeting? I had thought about how to answer this. Because at the meeting I had photographs in a flagged subsection and a suspicion. Now I have 51 pages and a forensic accounting and a court filing he made without telling either of us. There's a difference between suspecting someone and being able to prove it. Marcus looked at me across the table. He had our father's eyes. Very dark, very direct, The kind of eyes that miss nothing when they're paying attention. He hadn't been paying attention. That was the thing neither of us needed to say aloud. "What do we do?" he asked. "We sign the petition," I said. "All three of us." I called Nadia the next morning. She went very quiet when I told her the particular quality of quiet that is not emptiness but compression, all the feeling pressing inward. She asked me to send her the documents. I did. She called back 2 hours later and said, "Tell me where to sign." Prescott arrived at the hearing with his attorney, a silver-haired man named Caulfield, who had the bearing of someone who has spent 30 years making problems manageable for wealthy clients. They came in together, unhurried, Prescott in a charcoal suit and a burgundy tie, carrying a leather portfolio that matched the ones he'd placed at our seats at the family meeting. The performance of preparedness, the costume of a man who expects a procedural skirmish and intends to win it on composure. I was already seated at the petitioner's table with Delia when they came through the door. Delia had a banker's box beside her chair and a yellow legal pad covered in her careful, small handwriting. I had my copy of the documentation log. I had worn my grey suit, the one I bought the year I was promoted to Chief Compliance Officer, the one that says nothing decorative and everything necessary. Prescott glanced at me as he settled into his seat. He gave me a brief nod, the kind that is meant to convey confidence by association, as if his composure might be something I could catch, something that would make me reconsider the room I was sitting in. I looked back at him without expression and turned to my documents. Judge Anita Vasseur came in at precisely 9 o'clock. She was a compact woman in her late 50s, with close-cropped natural hair and the focused economy of movement that belongs to people who do not waste time. She had been on the bench for 7 years. Before that, 12 years in the trust division, first as a clerk and then as a staff attorney. Delia had told me she'd read every published opinion Judge Vasseur had written on fiduciary duty. I had read 3 of them myself the night before, sitting in my father's study with the orange blossom candle burning. "We're here on a petition for trustee removal and surcharge in the matter of the Adeyemi Family Revocable Trust," Judge Vasseur said, settling her reading glasses. "Ms. Marchetti Cross, you may proceed." Delia stood. She was unhurried and precise in the way of someone who has rehearsed not by memorizing words, but by understanding the architecture of what she needed to build. "Your Honour, the petitioners, Solange Adeyemi-Whitfield, Marcus Adeyemi, and Yemi Adeyemi-Osei, all adult income beneficiaries of the Adeyemi Family Revocable Trust, bring this petition on 4 grounds: breach of the duty of loyalty through self-dealing, breach of the duty to account through willful omission of material financial information, breach of the duty to inform through failure to provide advance notice of major trust decisions, and evidence of misappropriation of trust assets. We will introduce 17 exhibits." Caulfield shifted slightly in his seat. 17. I watched him register the number. Exhibits A through D were the paper trail of the disclosure failure, the time-stamped photographs from the villa window showing Prescott and Garrett Wills on the property on a Saturday afternoon, the certified mail request I'd sent for a full accounting with the return receipt, the accounting Prescott had provided, with 3 transaction categories absent, and a side-by-side analysis, prepared by Delia's paralegal, showing what a complete accounting under state trust law was required to contain versus what we had received. The duty to account, Delia told the court, is not discretionary. A trustee holds assets in a fiduciary capacity, which means full financial transparency is owed to beneficiaries as a matter of law, not courtesy, not convenience. When the accounting arrived missing 3 years of rental income from 2 properties, that was not an administrative oversight. That was a failure of a legal obligation that exists precisely because beneficiaries have no other way to know what is being done with assets held on their behalf. Judge Vasseur made a note. She did not look up. Exhibits E through G covered the notice failures. The trust instrument subsection 6.4, requiring 30 days written notice before any encumbrance of real property, followed by documentation showing no such notice was ever provided. Then the court motion Prescott had filed, to authorise the refinancing without full beneficiary consent, with the service records showing it had been served on Marcus and Yemi, but not on me. The trustee filed a motion in this court, Delia said, that directly affected Ms. Adeyemi-Whitfield's rights as a beneficiary and deliberately excluded her from service. This is not a procedural oversight. This is a trustee attempting to use the court to advance his own interests while concealing that attempt from the beneficiary most likely to recognise what he was doing. Across the aisle I heard Caulfield murmur something to Prescott. Prescott's expression remained composed. It was the kind of composure that requires effort, the stillness of something held rather than the stillness of something settled. Exhibits H through J were the self-dealing evidence. The Langley Premier Group prospectus, with footnote 14, enlarged to a readable size and projected onto the courtroom's display screen. The amended investment policy statement, with the concentration limits removed, and the beneficiary acknowledgement section blank. The registration documents for Langley Premier Group, LLC, confirming Prescott held a controlling interest. The duty of loyalty, Delia told the court, is the cornerstone of fiduciary law. A trustee must subordinate his own interests entirely to the interests of the beneficiaries he serves. He may not enter into transactions in which he has a personal financial stake without full, advanced disclosure and informed consent. Prescott had proposed directing trust assets into his own development company, buried the disclosure in an 8-point footnote, amended the investment policy statement to remove the protections that would have blocked the transaction, and called it a growth opportunity. This is the definition of self-dealing, Delia said, and it is the definition of a breach of the duty of loyalty. Then she picked up Exhibit K, and the room changed. Your Honour, I'd like to introduce the forensic accounting report prepared by Solange Adeyemi-Whitfield, a licensed forensic accountant with 22 years of experience in financial compliance and trust administration. She handed a bound copy to the clerk, who carried it to the bench. Judge Vasseur accepted it without comment, opened to the first page, and began to read. No one spoke. I had spent 11 days on the report. I had pulled county records, corporate registration documents, bank routing analyses from publicly available sources, and the partial accounting Prescott had provided. Then I had mapped the gaps. Rental income from the Alderton Street property and the Murray commercial unit had been collected regularly over 3 years. I could document that through the lease agreements on file with the county and through utility and tax records that referenced the properties as income generating. But none of that income appeared in the trust's accounting. It had gone somewhere else. It had gone to Harrow Capital Management LLC, which had one managing member, which was not the Adeyemi Family Revocable Trust. $342,000 over 37 months. The judge read for 3 minutes and 50 seconds. I know because I was watching the clock on the courtroom wall without appearing to watch it, which is a skill I developed in audit meetings 20 years ago and have never lost. When she looked up, she looked at Prescott. "Mr. Caulfield," she said, "does your client dispute the rental income figures in Exhibit K?" Caulfield leaned in, a whispered exchange. Prescott's jaw moved. His hand, which had been resting loosely on the portfolio in front of him, flattened against the table. I watched the knuckles. "Your Honour, my client would like the opportunity to provide a full response. The petition has been pending for 3 weeks, Mr. Caulfield. Your client filed his own motion with this court 6 weeks before that. He has had ample opportunity to prepare a response." She paused. "Does he dispute the figures in Exhibit K?" Another whispered exchange. Shorter this time. "Not at this juncture, Your Honour." Delia placed exhibits, L through Q, on the record. The informal development inquiry flag on the carriage house and rear easement parcel, dated 6 weeks before the family meeting, confirming that Prescott had been exploring the sale of trust property before he'd ever framed it as a conversation for the family. The call log from the afternoon I'd submitted the accounting request, when he'd suggested I had concerns he could address privately. The photographs from the garden, time-stamped. Then she said, "The petitioners request the immediate removal of Prescott Langley as trustee of the Adeyemi Family Revocable Trust, the appointment of an independent professional trustee, the freezing of all pending trust transactions, a civil surcharge in the amount of $342,000 plus interest and fees, and referral to the appropriate authorities for investigation of potential criminal conduct." She sat down. The room was very quiet. Judge Vasseur looked at the documents in front of her for a long moment. Then she removed her reading glasses and looked at Prescott directly. "Mr. Langley," she said. Her voice was level, unhurried, the voice of a woman who has said consequential things in courtrooms for a long time and understands that volume is not authority. A trustee does not own the assets in his care. He holds them in trust. It appears you have confused the two. Prescott's composure fractured. Not dramatically. Not the way it happens in films with visible collapse. It was subtler than that, and in some ways, worse. A slight loosening around the jaw, a shift in the quality of his stillness, as if the held thing had finally become too heavy. He looked like a man who has run a very long distance and has just been told the finish line was never where he thought it was. Judge Vasseur replaced her glasses. "The petition for immediate trustee removal is granted, all pending trust transactions, including the refinancing motion filed by the respondent, are frozen effective immediately. The court will appoint a licensed corporate trustee to assume administration of the Adeyemi Family Revocable Trust with full authority to audit prior transactions and pursue recovery of any misappropriated assets. The civil surcharge matter will proceed to the damages phase." She paused. "Given the evidence presented in Exhibit K, this matter is referred to the State Attorney General's office for investigation of potential criminal breach of fiduciary duty and fraudulent conversion of trust assets." The gavel came down. The sound was not loud. It didn't need to be. Prescott stood. He turned, slowly, the way people turn when they are recalibrating, and looked across the courtroom at me. I cannot know what he expected to see. Perhaps satisfaction. Perhaps the grief he had been counting on from the beginning. I was gathering my documents. I stacked the forensic report on top of the documentation log and aligned the edges the way I always do, a habit from 2 decades of filing evidence, and I slid them into my folder and closed the clasp. By the time I looked up, he was gone. The corporate trustee, a licensed firm called Meridian Fiduciary Services, assumed management of the Adeyemi Family Trust within 10 days of the hearing. Their senior administrator, a methodical woman named Constance Hale, called me the following Monday to introduce herself and to say that she had reviewed the forensic accounting report and intended to use it as the foundation for the recovery audit. "This is thorough work," she said. There was the professional appreciation of one careful person for another. "My father built something worth protecting," I said. 4 months later, the State Attorney General's office indicted Prescott Langley on 2 counts of criminal breach of fiduciary duty and 1 count of fraudulent conversion of trust assets, a felony with a sentencing range of up to 7 years. His development company collapsed without the trust equity it had been counting on. The carriage house and the rear easement parcel were never sold. The gardenias bloomed again in June. Marcus called me the evening the civil surcharge judgment was announced. He was quiet on the phone in the way he'd been quiet at his kitchen table, the recalculating quiet, not the empty kind. "I should have paid more attention," he said. "You trusted someone who gave you reasons to trust him. That's not a character flaw." "You didn't trust him?" "I had different tools." I thought about how to say the next part. "Dad built that trust to protect all of us. The protection only works if someone's watching how it's being used. That's not suspicion, that's just stewardship." Marcus was quiet for a moment, then, "Will you work with Meridian? Constance Hale seems to want a point of contact who actually understands the trust instruments." "She asked me yesterday," I said. I said yes. I walked the East Garden on an early morning in late August, when the air still carried the coolness of the night before, and the light came through the sculpted hedgerows at an angle that made everything look like something worth keeping. The dew was on the roses. The carriage house door stood open the way I always kept it in summer to let the warmth circulate. I walked the path my father had laid in 1989, flat stones from a quarry in the eastern part of the state, carried here 1 load at a time, and I let myself move slowly, which is not a thing I do easily. I am not, by disposition, a woman who lingers, but some mornings call for it. At the rear of the garden, I came to the iron gate. My father had installed it the year I was born. He had chosen ironwork over aluminum because he said good things should be heavy. The hinges were original. The latch still lifted with the same 2-handed technique I'd learned as a child, thumb under the tongue of the latch while the other hand took the gate's weight. It opened without complaint. I rested my hand on the upright post. The iron was cool still, warming slowly in the early light. Behind me, the villa sat in its full morning quiet. All 12,000 square feet of the life my father had assembled over 40 years, intact and unencumbered and still, after everything, ours. I had a legal folder tucked under my other arm. Inside it were the preliminary findings from Meridian's audit, 3 items for Constance Hale's review and a letter from the Attorney General's office confirming the indictment had proceeded to trial preparation. I would drive it downtown later this morning. For now, I stood at the gate. My father had known something that I had spent the last several months watching proven true, that wealth without vigilance is just borrowed time. He had built a trust, not because he was afraid, but because he understood that the structures we put around the things we love are only as strong as the people who are willing to stand inside them and pay attention. He had given us the document. He had given us the property. He had given us, perhaps without entirely meaning to, the professional in the family who would know what to do when someone tested it. The gate was still standing. The ironwork was sound. So was the trust now, with the right steward in place. So was I. I let the gate close gently behind me, turned back toward the house along the stone path and went inside to begin the work of the day.